button, ring that notification bell to be updated on videos, on live videos, whether it's story time or whether we're doing other things. You can check me out also on Patreon and thegentlemanpsychic.com. Today we are going to continue reading Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. We will finish it this evening. And if there is time permitted, I am going to go on to some other Victorian ghost stories. So sit back, relax, pour yourself a nice cup of tea, or gin, or vodka, or some wassail, whatever it may be. Someone says tequila. Hello, welcome. I see so many lovelies. Hello. We left off last week with our hero. What am I drinking? It's a little bit of an Earl Grey. A little cocoa, I'm actually kind of allergic to cocoa, but I do it anyway. My own blend of teas. I also, before I jump into A Christmas Carol, I wanted to show you this lovely pin that I was given. Do you see this? Isn't that gorgeous? Hello Mary Jane, good to see you, my lovely. One of my very dear friends gave this to me, and I am so deeply honored to wear this beautiful pin right there. And it kind of complements my necklace, I think. Anyway, so thank you for joining me. I am so very lucky to have so many wonderful friends on this planet, and you mean the world to me, and I'm so grateful that we can spend time together, albeit via the internet. But I'm so grateful for this experience. And I want to go ahead and jump right into A Christmas Carol. So last week we left our hero, Ebenezer Scrooge, with the third spirit about to approach. He has gone through the first, the second, and now the clock is about to strike, and the third Christmas spirit is about to join. One more cup of tea. Delightful. Stave 4, the last of the spirits. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. Hello, Dilusaro, lovely to see you. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which the spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. But for this it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. He felt that it was tall and stately when it came beside him, and that its mysterious presence filled him with a solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved. I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come, said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand. You are about to show me shadows of the things that have not happened, but will happen in time before us, Scrooge pursued. Is that so, spirit? The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head, but was the only answer he received. Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and he found that he could hardly stand when he prepared to follow it. The spirit paused for a moment, as observing his condition, and giving him time to recover. But Scrooge was all the worse for this. It thrilled him with a vague, uncertain horror to know that behind the dusky shroud there were ghostly eyes intently fixed upon him, while he, though he stretched his own to utmost, could see nothing but special hand and one great heap of black. "Ghost of the future," he exclaimed, "I fear you more than any spectre I have seen. But as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from this what I was, I am prepared to bear you company, and do it with a thankful heart. You will not speak to me?" It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them. "Lead on," said Scrooge. "Lead on. The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit." The phantom moved away as it had come towards him. Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which bore him up, he thought, and carried him along. They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city rather seemed to spring up about them and encompass them of its own act. But there they were, in the heart of it, on 'change, amongst the merchants who hurried up and down and chinked the money in their pockets, and conversed in groups, and looked at their watches, and trifled thoughtfully with their great gold seals, and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen, observing that the hand was pointed to them. Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin. "I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another. "Last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him?" asked a third, taking a vast quantity of snuff out of a very large snuff-box. "I thought he'd never die." "God knows," said the first with a yawn. What has he done with his money?" asked a red-faced gentleman with a pendulous excrescence on the end of his nose that shook like gills of a turkey cock. "I haven't heard," said the man with the large chin, yawning again. "Left it to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know." This pleasantry was received with a general laugh. "It's likely to be a very cheap funeral, and the same speaker, for upon my life I don't know of anybody to go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer?" "I don't mind going if lunch is provided," observed the gentleman with the excrescence on his nose. "But I must be fed if I make one." Another laugh. "Well, I am the most disinterested among you, after all," said the first speaker, "for I never wear black gloves, and I never eat lunch, but I'll offer to go. If anybody else will, when I come to think of it, I'm not at all sure that I wasn't his most particular friend, for we used to stop in and speak whenever we met. Bye-bye." Speakers and listeners strolled away, and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men, and looked toward the spirit for an explanation. The phantom glided on into a street. Its finger pointed to two persons meeting. Scrooge listened again, thinking that the explanation might be here. He knew these men also, perfectly. They were men of business, very wealthy, and of great importance. He had made a point always of standing well in their esteem, in a business point of view, that is, strictly in a business point of view. "How are you?" said one. "How are you?" returned the other. "Well," said the first, "Old Scratch has got his own at last, eh?" "So I'm told," returned the second. "Cold, isn't it? Seasonable for Christmas time. You're not a skater, I suppose?" No, something else to think of. Good morning." Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting. Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach importance to conversations apparently so trivial, but feeling assured that they must have some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what it was likely to be. They could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob and his old partner, for that was past, and this ghost province was the future. Nor could he think of any one immediately connected with himself to whom he could apply them, but nothing doubting that to whomsoever they applied, they had some latent moral for his own improvement. He resolved to treasure up every word he heard and everything he saw, and especially to observe the shadow of himself when it appeared, for he had an expectation that the conduct of his future self would give him the clue he missed, and would render the solution of these riddles easy. He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in through the porch. It gave him little surprise, however, for he had been resolving in his mind a change of life, and thought he hoped he saw his new-born resolutions carried out in this. Quiet and dark, beside him stood the phantom, with its outstretched hand. When he roused himself from the thoughtful quest, he fancied from the turn of the hand and its situation in reference to himself that the unseen eyes were looking at him keenly. It made him shudder and feel very cold. They left the busy scene and went into an obscure part of the town, where Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognized its situation and its bad repute. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half-naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly, and alleys and archways, like so many cesspools, disgorged their offences of smell and dirt and life upon the staggering streets, and the whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth, and with misery. For in this den of infamous resort, there was a low-browed, beetling shop, below a penthouse roof, where iron, old rags, bottles and bones, and greasy offal were bought. Upon the floor, within, were piled up heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, hinges, files, scales, weights, and refuse iron of all kinds. Secret that few would like to scrutinize were bred and hidden in mountains of unseemly rags, masses of corrupted fat, and sepulchres of bones sitting in among the wares he dealt in. By a charcoal stove, made of old bricks, was a grey-haired rascal nearly 70 years of age, who had screened himself from the cold air without by a frowsy curtaining of miscellaneous tatters hung upon a line, and smoked his pipe in all the luxury of calm retirement. Scrooge and the phantom came into the presence of this man just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman similarly laden came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, they all three burst into a laugh. "Let the chairwoman alone to be the first," cried she who had entered first. "Let the laundress alone to be the second, and let the undertaker's man alone to be the third. Look here, old Joe, here's a chance, if we haven't all three met here without meaning it." "You couldn't have met in a better place," said old Joe, removing his pipe from his mouth. "Come into the parlour. You were made free of it long ago, you know, and the other two ain't strangers. Stop till I shut the door of the shop. Ah, how it shrieks! There ain't such a rusty bit of metal in the place as its own hinges. I believe, and I'm sure there's no such old bones here as mine. Aha! We're all suitable to our calling. We're all matched. Come into the parlour. Come into the parlour. The parlour was the space behind the curtain of rags. The old man raked the fire together with an old stir-rod, and having trimmed his smoky lamp, for it was night, with the stem of his pipe put it in his mouth again. While he did this, the woman, who had already spoken, threw her bundle on the floor and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool, crossing her elbows on her knees, and looking with a bold defiance at the other two. "What odds, then? What odds, Mrs. Dilber?" said the woman. "Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did." "That's true indeed," said the laundress. "No man more so." "Why then, don't stand staring as if you were afraid, woman. Who's the wiser? We're not going to pick holes in each other's coats, I suppose?" "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dilber and the man together. "We should hope not." "Very well then," cried the woman. "That's enough. Who's the worse for the loss of things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose?" "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dilber, laughing. "If you wanted to keep him after he was dead, a wicked old screw," pursued the woman. "Why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, it'd have been somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out his last there, alone all by himself." "It is the truest word that was ever spoke," said Mrs. Dilber. "It's a judgment on him." "I wish it was a little heavier judgment," replied the woman, "and it should have been. You may depend upon it. I could have laid my hands on anything else. Open that bundle, old Joe, and let me know the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid to see them. Afraid for them to see it. We knew pretty well that we were helping ourselves before we met here, I believe. It's no sin. Open the bundle, Joe." But the gallantry of her friends which would not allow of this, and the man in faded black, mounting the breach first, produced his plunder. It was not extensive. A seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value were all. They were severely examined and aspired by old Joe, who chalked the sums who disposed to give for each upon the wall, and added them up to the total when he found that there was nothing more to come. "That's your account," said Joe, "and I wouldn't give another sixpence if I was to be boiled for not doing it. Who's next?" Mrs. Dilber was next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in the same manner. "I've always give too much to the ladies. It's a weakness of mine. And that's the way I ruin myself," said Joe. "That's your account. If you asked me for another penny and made it an open question, I'd repent of being so liberal and knock off half a crown." "And now undo my bundle, Joe," the first woman said. Joe went down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening it, and having fastened a great many knots, dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff. "What do you call this?" said Joe. "Bed curtains?" "Ah," returned the woman, laughing, and leaning forward on her crossed arms. "Bed curtains. You don't mean to say you took 'em down rings and all with him lying there?" said Joe. "Yes, I do," replied the woman. "Why not?" She prayed forgiveness for the next moment, and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart. When the half-drunken woman, whom I told you of last night, said to me when I tried to see him and obtain a week's delay, and what I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me, turns out to have been quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying then. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know, but before, did I skip a page? Ah, there we go. I did skip a page. I beg your pardon. Bed curtains? Yes, I do, replied the woman. Why not? You were born to make your fortune, said Joe, and you'll certainly do it. I certainly shan't hold my hand when I can get anything in it by reaching out for the sake of such a man as he was. I promise you, Joe, returned the woman coolly. Don't drop that oil upon the blankets now. His blankets? Asked Joe. Who else's, you think? Replied the woman. He isn't likely to take cold without 'em, I dare say. I hope he didn't die of anything catching, eh? Said old Joe, stopping in his work and looking up. Don't you be afraid of that, returned the woman. I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter about him for such things if he did. Ah, you may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it, nor a threadbare place. It's the best he had, and fine one too. They'd have wasted it if he hadn't been for me. What do you call wasting of it? Asked old Joe. Putting it on him to be buried in, to be sure, replied the woman with a laugh. Somebody was a fool enough to do it, but I took it off him again, and I took him off it again. If calico ain't enough for such purpose, it isn't good enough for anything. It's quite as becoming as a body. He can't look uglier than he did in that one. Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror, as they sat grouped about their spoil, and in the scantily light afforded by the old man's lamp, he viewed them with the destination and disgust which could hardly have been greater, though they had been obscene demons marketing the corpse itself. Ha! Laughed the same woman. Then when old Joe, producing a flannel bag with money in it, told out several gains upon the ground. This was the end of it, you see. He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive, to profit us when he was dead. Ha 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 ha! Spirit, said Scrooge, shuddering from head to foot. I see. The case is this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now, merciful heaven. What is this? He recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bed, a bare, uncurtained bed, on which beneath a ragged sheet there lay something covered up, which, though it was dumb, announced itself in awful language. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge glanced round it in obedience to a secret impulse, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light rising in the outer air fell straight upon the bed, and on it plundered the bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this man. Scrooge glanced towards the phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, felt how easy it would be to do so, and longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the spectre at his side. O cold, cold, rigid, dreadful death, set upon thine altar here, and dress it with such terrors as thou hast at thy command, for this is thy dominion. But if the loved, revered, and honoured head, thou canst not turn one hair to thy dread purposes, or make one feature odious, it is not that the hand is heavy, and will fall down when released. It is not that the heart and pulse are still, but that the hand was open, generous and true, the heart brave, warm and tender, and the pulse a man's strike, and see his good deeds, springing from the wound, to sow the world with life immortal. No voice pronounced these words in Scrooge's ears, and yet he heard them. When he looked upon the bed, he thought, if this man could be raised up now, he would be his foremost thoughts, avarice, hard dealing, griping, cares. They have brought him into a rich end, truly. He lay in the dark, empty house, with not a man, a woman, or a child to say he was kind to me in this or that. And for the memory of one kind word, I will be kind to him. A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in the room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge did not dare think. "Spirit," he said, "this fearful place, in leaving it I shall not leave its lesson, trust me. Let us go." Still, the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger to the head. "I understand you," Scrooge returned, "and I would do it if I could, but I have not the power, Spirit, I have not the power." Again it seemed to look upon him. "If there is any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death," said Scrooge, quite agonized, "show that person to me, Spirit, I beseech you." The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment like a wing, and withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight where a mother and her child were. She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room, started at every sound, looked out from the window, glanced at the clock, tried, but in vain, to work with her needle, and could hardly bear the voices of the children in their play. At length the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and oppressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight of which he felt ashamed and which he struggled to repress. He sat down to dinner that had been hoarding for him by the fire, and when she asked him faintly what news, which was not until after a long silence, he appeared embarrassed how to answer. "Is it good or bad?" she said, to help him. "Bad," he answered. "We are quite ruined?" "No, there's hope yet, Caroline." "If he relents," she nodded, amazed. "There is nothing is past hope, if such a miracle has happened." "He's past relenting," said her husband. "He's dead." She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so, with clasped hands. She prayed forgiveness for the next moment, and was very sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart. "What the half-drunken woman, whom I told you of last night, said to me when I tried to see him and obtain a week's delay, and what I have thought was a mere excuse to avoid me, turns out he gave me quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying then. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know, but before that time we shall be ready with the money, and even though we were not, it would be a bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline." Yes, soften it as they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces hushed and clustered round to hear what they so little understood were brighter, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show him, caused by the event, was one of pleasure. "Let me see some tenderness connected with the death," said Scrooge, "or that dark chamber, Spirit, which we left just now. Will it be forever present to me?" The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. He entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner, and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing but surely they were very quiet. And he took the child and set him in the midst of them. Where had Scrooge heard those words? He had not dreamt them. The boy must have read them out as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand up to her face. "The colour hurts my eyes," she said. "The colour, poor Tiny Tim." "They're better now again," said Cratchit's wife. "It makes them weak by candlelight. And I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home, for the world. It must be near his time." "Past it, rather," Peter answered, shutting up his book. "But I think he's walked a little slower than he used to, these few last evenings, Mother." They were very quiet again. At last she said, in a steady, cheerful voice that only faltered once, I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulders very fast indeed." "So have I," cried Peter, "often." "And so have I," exclaimed another. "So had all. But he was very light to carry," she resumed, intent upon her work, "and his father loved him so, that it was no trouble, no trouble. And there's your father at the door." She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob, in his comforter, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it the most. Then the two young Cratchits got up on the knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, father, don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them, and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table, and praised the industry and the speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. "Sunday? You went today then, Robert?" said his wife. "Yes, my dear," returned Bob. "I wish you could have gone. It could have done you good to see how green the place it is. But you'll see it often. I promise him that I would walk there on a Sunday." "My little child," cried Bob, my little child." He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been farther apart, perhaps, than they were. He left the room and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face when he reconciled to what had happened, and went down again quite happy. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and the mother working still. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he had scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day, and seeing that he looked a little, just a little down, you know, said Bob, inquired what had happened to distress him. "On which," said Bob, "for he is pleasantest spoken gentleman you ever heard. I told him, 'I'm heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit,' he said, 'and heartily sorry for your good wife. By the by, how he ever knew that, I don't know.'" "Knew what, my dear?" "Why, that you were a good wife," replied Bob. "Everybody knows that," said Peter. "Very well observed, my boy," cried Bob. "I hope they do. Heartily sorry," he said, "for your good wife. If I can be of service in any way," he said, giving me his card, "that's where I live. Pray come to see me." "No, it wasn't," cried Bob, "for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us, so much as for the kind way that this was quite delightful. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim and felt with us." "I'm sure he's a good soul," said Mrs. Cratchit. "You would be surer of it, my dear," returned Bob. "If you saw and spoke to him, I shouldn't be at all surprised, mark what I say, if he got Peter a better situation." "Only hear that, Peter," said Mrs. Cratchit. "And then," cried one of the girls, "Peter will be keeping company with someone, and setting up for himself." "Get along with you," retorted Peter, grinning. "It's just as likely as not," said Bob. One of these days, though there's plenty of time for that, my dear, but however and whenever we part from one another, I'm sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we? Or this first parting, and there was among us. Never, father, cried all. And I know, said Bob, I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it. No, never, father, they all cried again. I'm very happy, said little Bob. I'm very happy. Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, his daughters kissed him, the two young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter and himself shook hands. Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God. Spectre, said Scrooge. Something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me what man that was whom we saw lying dead. The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him as before, though at a different time, he thought. Indeed, there seemed no order in these latter visions, save they were in the future into the resorts of businessmen, but showed him not himself. Indeed, the spirit did not stay for anything, but went straight on, as to the end just now desired, until besought by Scrooge to tarry for a moment. This court, said Scrooge, through which we hurry now, is where my place of occupation is, and has been for at length of time. I see the house. Let me behold what I shall be in the days to come. The spirit stopped. The hand was pointed elsewhere. The house is yonder, Scrooge exclaimed. Why do you point away? The inexorable finger underwent no change. Scrooge hastened to the window of his office and looked in. It was an office still, but not his. The furniture was not the same, and the figure in the chair was not himself. The phantom pointed as before. He joined at once, and wondering why and whither he had gone, accompanied it until they reached an iron gate. He paused to look round before entering. A churchyard here. Then the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walked in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, the growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too much burying, fat with repleted appetite, a worthy place. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. He advanced toward it trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but he dreaded that he saw new meaning in its solemn shape. Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point, said Scrooge, answer me one question. Are these shadows of things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only? Still, the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends to which, if persevered in, they must lead, said Scrooge. But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it thus, with what you show me. The spirit was as immovable as ever. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. Am I the man who lay upon that bed? He cried upon his knees. The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again. No, spirit, no spirit. The finger still was there. Spirit, he cried, tight clutching at its robe, hear me. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been for this intercourse. Why show me this, if I am past all hope? For the first time, The hand appeared to shake. "Good spirit," he pursued, as down upon the ground he fell before it, "your nature intercedes for me, and pities me, assures me that I yet may change these shadows you have showed me by an altered life." The kind hand trembled. I will honor Christmas in my heart, and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future, and the spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing on the stone." In his agony, he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself, but was strong in its entreaty, and attained it. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him, holding up his hands in the last prayer to have his fate reversed. He saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into bedpost. Stave 5, the end of it. Yes, and the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in. "I will live in the past, the present, the future," Scrooge repeated, as he scrambled out of bed. "The spirits of all three shall strive within me. Oh, Jacob Marley, heaven and the Christmas time, he be praised for this. I say it on my knees, oh, Jacob, on my knees." He was so fluttered and so glowing with his good intentions that his broken voice would scarcely answer to his call. He had been sobbing violently in his conflict with the spirit, and his face was wet with tears. "They are not torn down," cried Scrooge, folding one of his bed curtains in his arms. "They're not torn down, rings and all. They are here. I am here. The shadows of things that would have been may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will." His hands were busy with his garments all the time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, making them parties to every kind of extravagance. I don't know what to do," cried Scrooge, laughing and crying in the same breath, and making perfect lacoon of himself with his stocking. "I'm as light as a feather. I'm as happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. I'm as giddy as a drunken man. Oh, a Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to all the world. Hello there. Ooh, hello." He had frisked into the sitting room, and was now standing there perfectly winded. "There's the saucepan that the gruel was in," cried Scrooge, starting off again, and going round the fireplace. "There's the door by which the ghost of Jacob Marley entered. There's the corner where the ghost of Christmas presents sat. There's the window where I saw the wandering of Christmas presents, wandering of the spirits. It's all right. It's all true. It's all happened." Really, for a man who had been out of practice for so many years, it was a splendid laugh, the most illustrious laugh, the father of a long, long line of brilliant laughs. "Oh, I don't know what day of the month it is," said Scrooge. I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm quite a baby. Oh, never mind. I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. Hello. Woo. Hello there." He was checked in his transport by the churches ringing out the lustiest pearls he had ever heard. Clash, clang, hammer, ding, dong, bell, bell, dong, ding, hammer, clang, clash. Oh, glorious, glorious. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, clear, bright, jovial, stirring, cold, 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 piping for the blood to dance to golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet, fresh air, merry bells. Oh, glorious, glorious. You there! What's today? Cried Scrooge, calling down to a boy in Sunday clothes, who perhaps had loitered in to look about him. Eh? Returned the boy with all his might of wonder. What's today, my fine fellow? Said Scrooge. Today? Replied the boy. Why, it's Christmas Day. Oh, it's Christmas Day, said Scrooge to himself. Oh, I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. They can do anything they like. Oh, of course they can. Of course they can. Hello, my fine fellow. Hello, returned the boy. Do you know if the poulter's in the next street, but one at the corner? Scrooge inquired. I should hope I did, replied the lad. Oh, good, intelligent boy, said the Scrooge. Remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up in there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one. What? The big one? As big as me? Returned the boy. Oh, delightful boy, said Scrooge. It's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, my buck. It's hanging there now, replied the boy. It is, said Scrooge. Go and buy it. Walker, exclaimed the boy. No, said Scrooge. I am in earnest. Go and buy it, and tell him to bring it here, that I may give them directions where to take it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown. The boy was off like a shot. He must have had a steady hand at a trigger who could have got a shot off as fast. I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's, whispered Scrooge, rubbing his hands and splitting with a laugh. He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. Joe Miller never made such a joke as sending it to Bob's will be. The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it he did, somehow, and went down the stairs to open the street door, ready for the coming poulterer's man. As he stood there waiting his arrival, the knocker caught his eye. Oh, I shall love it as long as I live, cried Scrooge, patting it with his hand. I scarcely ever looked at it before. What an honest expression it has in its face. Oh, it's a wonderful knocker. Here's the turkey. Hello. How are you? Merry Christmas. It was a turkey. He never could have stood upon his legs, that bird. He would have snapped 'em short off in a minute, like sticks of sealing wax. Why, it's impossible to carry that to Camden Town, said Scrooge. Oh, you must have a cab. The chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he recompensed the boy, were only to be exceeded by the chuckle with which he sat down breathless in his chair again, and chuckled till he cried. I'll wait for the clock. Shaving was not an easy task, for his hand continued to shake very much, and shaving requires attention, even when you don't dance while you are at it. But if he had cut the end of his nose off, he would have put a piece of sticking plaster over it, and been quite satisfied. He dressed himself, all in his best, and at last got out into the streets, where people were by this time pouring forth. As he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present, and walking with his hands behind him, Scrooge regarded every one with a delightful smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-humoured fellows said, Good morning, sir, a Merry Christmas to you. And Scrooge said often afterwards that all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. He had not gone far when, coming on towards him, he beheld the portly gentleman who had walked into his counting-house the day before and said, Scrooge and Marley's, I believe. It sent a pang across his heart to think how this old gentleman would look upon him when they met, but he knew what path lay straight before him, and he took it. My dear sir, said Scrooge, quickening his pace and taking the old gentleman by both hands,
How do you do? I do hope you succeeded yesterday. It was very kind of you. A Merry Christmas to you, sir. Mr. Scrooge? Yes, said Mr. Scrooge. That's my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon. And will you have the goodness? Here Scrooge whispered in his ear. Lord bless me, cried the gentleman, as if his breath were taken away. My dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious? If you please, said Scrooge, not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that favour? My dear sir, said the other, shaking hands with him, I don't know what to say to such a, Don't say anything, please, retorted Scrooge. Come and see me, will you? Come and see me? I will, cried the old gentleman, and it was clear he meant to do it. Thank ye, said Scrooge. I am much obliged to you. I thank you 50 times, bless you. He went to church, and walked about the streets, and watched people hurrying to and fro, and patted children on the head, and questioned beggars, and looked down into the kitchens of houses, and up to the windows, and found that everything could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamt that any walk, that anything could give him so much happiness. In the afternoon, he turned his steps towards his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock. But he made a dash and did it. Is your master at home, my dear? Said Scrooge to a girl. Nice girl, very. Yes, sir. Where is he, my love? Said Scrooge. He's in the dining room, sir, along with the mistress. I'll show you upstairs, if you please. Thank you. He knows me, said Scrooge, with his hand already on the dining room lock. I'll go there, my dear. He turned it gently and sidled his face in, rounded the door. They were looking at the table, which was spread out in great array, for these young housekeepers are always nervous on such points and like to see that everything is right. Fred, said Scrooge, dear heart alive, how his niece by marriage started. Scrooge had forgotten for the moment about her sitting in the corner with a footstool, or he wouldn't have done it on any account. Hi, bless my soul, cried Fred. Who's that? It's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred? Let him in? It was a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. His niece looked just the same. So did Topper when he came, so did the plump sister when she came, so did everyone when they came. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office next morning. Oh, he was early there. If he could only be there first to catch Bob Cratchit coming late, that was the thing he had set his heart upon. And he did it. Yes, he did it. The clock struck 9. No, Bob. 1:15? No, Bob. He was full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with his door wide open, that he might see him come into the tank. His hat was off before he opened the door. His comforter, too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen, and if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock, as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock. Hello, growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, as near as he could feign it. What do you mean by coming in here at this time of day? I'm very sorry, sir, said Bob. I am behind my time. You are, repeated Scrooge. Yes, I think you are. Step this way, if you please. It's only once a year, sir, pleaded Bob, appearing from the tank. It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir. Now I'll tell you what, my friend, said Scrooge. I am not going to stand for this sort of thing any longer. And therefore, he continued, leaping from his stool, and giving Bob such a dig in his waistcoat that he staggered back into the tank again. And therefore, I'm about to raise your salary. Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him, and calling to the people in the court for help and a straight waistcoat. Merry Christmas, Bob, said Scrooge, with an earnestness that could not be mistaken. as he clapped him on the back. A Merry Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavour to assist your struggling family, and we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop. Oh, Bob, make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good as a friend, a good a master, and as good of a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough, in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset, and knowing that such as these would be blind. Anyway, he thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes and grin, as have the malady in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever afterward, and it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well. If any man alive possessed the knowledge, may that be truly said of us and of all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, every one. That was lovely. I hope you enjoyed A Christmas Carol. I am going to go on to some other... Oh, that was you. Hello, darling. I'm going to read a little bit longer. I'm going to read some Victorian Christmas ghosts. What do you say? We shall skip the introduction because that is copyrighted. Beyond of which these are 100-year-old stories, so I shan't have a problem. All right. Sir Walter Scott, The Tapestried Chamber. Testing out haunted houses featured frequently in ghost stories, but usually the brave soul made the decision willingly, either out of desire to disprove spiritualism or to simply enjoy a thrill with the creation of General Brown, an American war campaigner. Walter Scott, 1771 to 1832, describes a hearty masculine character who also has access to an elegant country house. In this tale, General Brown returns from war only to face a trial for which his handships in the Virginian wilds have not prepared him. This story first appeared in 1828 in The Keepsake, a literary annual that appeared at Christmas each year from 1825 to 1857. The following narrative is given from the pen, so far as memory permits, in the same character in which it was presented to the author's ear. Nor has he claimed further praise or to be more deeply censored than in proportion to the good or bad judgment which he has employed in selecting his materials, as he has studiously avoided any attempt at ornament which might interfere with simplicity of the tale. At the same time, it must be admitted that the particular class of stories which turns on the marvelous possesses a stronger influence, when told, than when committed to print. The volume taken up at noonday, though rehearsing the same indictments, conveys a much more feeble impression than is achieved by the voice of the speaker on a circle of fireside auditors, who hang upon the narrative as the narrator details the minute incidents which serve to give it authenticity, and lowers his voice with an affection of mystery while he approaches the fearful and wonderful part. It was with such advantages that the present writer heard the following events related more than 20 years since by celebrated Miss Seward of Lichfield, who, to her numerous accomplishments, added in a remarkable degree. Is this the story? Yes, it is, sorry. Remarkable degree, the power of her narrative in private conversation. In its present form, the tale must necessarily lose all the interest which was attached to it by the flexible voice and intelligent features of the gifted narrator. Yet still, read aloud to an undoubting audience by the doubtful light of the closing evening, or in silence, by a decaying taper, and amidst the solitude of half-lighted apartment, it may be redeemed its character as good ghost story. Miss Seward always affirmed that she had derived her information from an authentic source, although she suppressed the names of the two persons chiefly concerned. I will not avail myself of any particulars I may have since received concerning the localities of the detail, but suffer them to rest under the same general description in which they were first related to me. And, for the same reason, I will not add to or diminish the narrative by any circumstance, whether more or less material, but simply rehearse, as I heard it, a story of supernatural terror. About the end of the American War, when the officers of Lord Cornwall's army, which surrounded Yorktown, and others who had been made prisoners during the impolitic and ill-fated controversy, were returning to their own country to relate their adventures and repose themselves, after their fatigues, there was amongst them a general officer to whom Miss S. gave the name of Brown, but merely, as I understood, to save the inconvenience of introducing a nameless agent in the narrative. He was an officer of merit, as well as a gentleman of high consideration for family and attainments. Some business had carried General Brown upon tour through the western countries, when, in the conclusion of a morning stage, he found himself in the vicinity of a small country town, which presented a scene of uncommon beauty and of character peculiarly English. The little town, with its stately old church, whose tower bore testimony to the devotion of ages long past, lay amidst the pastures and cornfields of small extent, but bounded and divided with hedgerow timber of great age and size. There were few marks of modern improvement. The envisions of the place intimidated neither the solitude of decay nor the bustle of novelty. The houses were old but in good repair, and the beautiful little river murmured freely on its way to the left of the town, neither restrained by a dam nor bordered by a towing path. Upon a gentle eminence, nearly a mile to the southward of the town, were seen amongst many venerable oaks and tangled thickets the turrets of a castle as old as the wars of York and Lancaster, but which seemed to have received important alterations during the age of Elizabeth and her successor. It had not been a place of great size, but whatever accommodation it formerly afforded was, it must be supposed, still to be obtained within its walls. At least such was the inference which General Brown drew from observing the smoke arise merrily from the several of the ancient weathered and carved chimney stalks. The wall of the park ran alongside of the highway for 200 or 300 yards, and through the different points by which the eye found glimpses into the woodland scenery, it seemed to be well stocked. Other points of view opened in succession, now a full one, of the front of the old castle, and now side glimpse and its particular towers, the former rich in all the bizarre of the Elizabethan school, while the simple and solid strength of the parts of the building seemed to show what they had been raised more for defiance than ostentation.
delighted with the partial glimpses which he obtained of the castle through the woods and the glades by which his ancient feudal fortress was surrounded. Our military traveller was determined to inquire whether it might not deserve a nearer view, and whether it contained a family, pictures, or other objects of curiosity worthy a stranger's visit. When leaving the vicinity of the park, he rolled through a clean and well-paved street, and stopped at the door of the well-frequented inn. Before ordering horses to proceed on his journey, General Brown made inquiries concerning the proprietor of the chateau, which had so attracted his admiration, and was equally surprised and pleased at hearing it in reply. A nobleman named, whom we shall call Lord Woodville. How fortunate! Much of Brown's early recollections, both at school and at college, had been reconnected with young Woodville, whom, by a few questions, he now ascertained to be the same with the owner of this fair domain. He had been raised to the peerage by the decease of his father a few months before, and as the general learned from the landlord, the term of mourning being ended, was now taking possession of his paternal estate. In the jovial season of merry autumn, accompanied by a select party of friends to enjoy the sports of country famous for game, this was delightful news to our traveller. Frank Woodville had been Richard Brown's fag at Eton, and his chosen intimate at Christ Church. Their pleasures and their tasks had been the same, and the honest soldier's heart warmed to find his early friend in possession of so delightful a residence, and of an estate, as the landlord assured him, with a nod and a wink, fully adequate to maintain and add to his dignity. Nothing was more natural than that the traveller should suspend the journey, which there was nothing to render hurried, to pay a visit to an old friend under such agreeable circumstances. The fresh horses, therefore, had only the brief task to conveying the general's travelling carriage to Woodville Castle. A porter admitted them to a modern Gothic lodge, built in that style to correspond with the castle itself, and at the same time rang a bell to give warning of the approach of visitors. Apparently, the sound of the bell had suspended the separation of the company, bent on the various amusements of the morning, for on entering the court of the chateau, several young men were lounging about in their sporting dresses, looking at and criticizing the dogs which the keepers held in readiness to attend their pastime. As General Brown alighted, the young lord came to the gate of the hall, and for an instant gazed as at a stranger upon the countenance of his friend, on which war, with its fatigues and its wounds, had made a great alteration. But the uncertainty lasted no longer than till the visitor had spoken, and the hearty greeting which followed was such as can only be exchanged betwixt those who have passed together the merry days of careless boyhood, of early youth. "If I could have formed a wish, my dear Brown," said Lord Woodville, "it would have been to have you here, of all men upon this occasion, which my friends are good enough to hold as a sort of a holiday. Do not think you have been unwatched during the years you have been absent from us. I have traced you through your dangers, your triumphs, your misfortunes, and was delighted to see that, whether in victory or defeat, the name of my old friend was always distinguished with applause." The general made a suitable reply, and congratulated his friend on his new dignities and the possession of a place and domain so beautiful. "Nay, you have seen nothing of it yet," said Lord Woodville, "and I trust you do not mean to leave us till you are better acquainted with it. It is true, I confess, that my present party is pretty large, and the old house, like other places of the kind, does not possess so much accommodation as the extent of the outward walls appears to promise. But we can give you a comfortable old-fashioned room, and I venture to suppose that your campaigns
have taught you to be glad of worse quarters. The general shrugged his shoulders and laughed. I presume, he said, the worst apartment at your chateau is considerably superior to the old tobacco cask in which I was fain to take up in my night's lodging when I was in the bush, as the Virginians call it. With a light corpse, there I lay, like Diogenes himself, so delighted with my covering from the element that I made a vain attempt to have rolled it up my next quarters, but my commander, for the time, would give way to no such luxurious provision, and I took farewell to my beloved cask with tears in my eyes. Well then, since you do not fear your quarters, said Lord Woodville, you will stay with me a week at least. Of guns, dogs, fishing rods, flies, and means of sport by sea and land, we have enough and to spare. You cannot pitch on an amusement, but we will find the means of pursuing it. But if you prefer the gun and the pointers, I will go with you myself and see whether you have mended your shooting since you have been amongst the Indians of the back settlement. The general gladly accepted his friendly host's proposal in all its points. After the morning of the many exercise, the company met at dinner, where it was to the delight of Lord Woodville to conduce to the display of high properties of his recovered friend, so as to recommend him to his guests, most of whom were persons of distinction. He led General Brown to speak of the scenes he had witnessed, and as every word marked alike the brave officer and the sensible man who retained possession of his cool judgment. Under the most imminent dangers, the company looked upon the soldier with general respect, as on one who had proved himself possessed of an uncommon portion of personal courage, that attribute of all others, of which everybody desires to be thought possessed. The day at Woodville Castle ended as usual, and in such mansions, the hospitality stopped within the limits of good order. Music, in which the young lord was proficient, succeeded in the circulation of the bottle, cards, and billiards. For those who preferred such amusements were in readiness, but the exercise of the morning required early hours, and not long after 11 o'clock, the guests began to retire to their several apartments. The young lord himself conducted his friend, General Brown, to the chamber destined for him, which answered to the description he had given it, being comfortable, old-fashioned. The bed was of the massive form used in the end of the 17th century, and the curtains of faded silk, heavily trimmed with tarnished gold, but then the sheets, pillows, and blankets looked delightful to the campaigner. When he thought of his mansion, the cask, there was an air of gloom in the tapestry hangings, which their worn-out graces curtained the walls of the little chamber, and gently undulated as the autumnal breeze found its way through the ancient lattice window, which pattered and whistled as the air gained entrance. The toilette, too, with its mirror, turbaned after the manner of the beginning of the century, with a coiffure of murrey-coloured silk, and its 100 strange-shaped boxes, providing for arrangements which had been obsolete for more than 50 years, had an antique and in so far melancholy aspect, but nothing could blaze more brightly and cheerfully than 2 large wax candles, or, if aught could rival them, it was the flaming, bickering faggots in the chimney. Now, mind you, this is not what that means in that's not what that means. Mind you. In the chimney, where am I? To gleam their warmth through the smug apartment, which, notwithstanding the general antiquity of its appearance, was not wanting in the least convenience that modern habits rendered either necessary or desirable. "This is an old-fashioned sleeping apartment, General," said the young lord, "but I hope you find nothing that makes you envy your old tobacco cask." "I'm not particularly respecting my lodgings," replied the general, Yet were I to make any choice, I would prefer this chamber by many degrees to the gayer and more modern rooms of your family mansion. Believe me, that when I unite its modern air of comfort with its venerable antiquity, and recollect that it's your lordship's property, I shall feel in better quarters here than if I were in the best hotel in London could afford. I trust, I have no doubt, that you will find yourself as comfortable as I wish you, my dear General, said the young nobleman, and once more bidding his guest good night, he shook him by the hand and withdrew. The General once more looked round him, and internally congratulating himself on his return to peaceful life, the comforts of which were endeared by the recollection of the hardships and dangers he had lately sustained, undressed himself, and prepared for luxurious night's rest. Here, contrary to the custom of this species of tale, we leave the General in possession of his apartment until the next morning. The company assembled for breakfast at an early hour, but without the appearance of General Brown, who seemed the guest the Lord Woodville was desirous of honouring above all whom his hospitality had assembled round him. He more than once expressed surprise at the General's absence, and at length sent the servant to make inquiry after him. The man brought back information that General Brown had been walking abroad since an early hour of the morning in defiance of the weather, which was misty and ungenial. The custom of a soldier, said the young nobleman to his friends. Many of them acquire habitual vigilance, and cannot sleep after the early hour at which their duty usually commands them to be alert. Yet the explanation which Lord Woodville then offered the company seemed hardly satisfactory to his own mind, and it was in a fit of silence and abstraction that he awaited the return of the General. It took place near an hour after breakfast bell had rung. He looked fatigued and feverish. His hair, the powdering and arrangement of which was at the time one of the most important occupations of a man's whole day, and marked his fashion as much in the present time. The tying of a cravat, or the want of one, was dishevelled, uncurled, void of powder, and dank with dew. His clothes were huddled on with careless negligence, remarkable in a military man, whose real or supposed duties are usually held to include some attention to the toilette, and his looks were haggard and ghastly in a peculiar degree. "So you have stolen a march upon this morning, my dear General," said Lord Woodville, "or you have not found your bed so much to your mind as I had hoped and you seemed to expect. How did you rest last night?" "Oh, excellently well, remarkably well, never better in my life," said General Brown rapidly. And yet with an air of embarrassment which was obvious to his friend, he then hastily swallowed a cup of tea, and neglecting or refusing whatever else was offered, seemed to fall into a fit of abstraction. "You will take the gun today, General?" said his friend and host, and had to repeat the question twice ere he received the abrupt answer. "No, my lord, I'm sorry I cannot have the honour of spending another day with your lordship. My post horses are ordered, and will be here directly." All who were present showed surprise, and Lord Woodville immediately replied, "Post horses, my good friend? What can you possibly want with them, when you promised to stay with me quietly for at least a week?" "I believe," said the General, obviously much embarrassed, "that I might, in the pleasure of my first meeting with your lordship, have said something about stopping here a few days, but I have since found it altogether impossible." "It is very extraordinary," answered the young nobleman. "You seemed quite disengaged yesterday, and you cannot have had summons today, for our post has not come up from the town, and therefore you could not have received any letters." General Brown, without giving any further explanation, muttered something of indispensable business, and insisted on the absolute necessity of his departure in the manner which silenced all opposition on the part of his host, who saw that his resolution was taken, and forbore all further
importunity. At least, however, he said, permit me, my dear Brown, since you go, will or must, to show you the view of the terrace which the mist that is now rising will soon display. He threw open the sash window and stepped down upon the terrace as he spoke. The general followed him mechanically, but seemed little to attend to what the host was saying. As looking across an extended and rich prospect, he pointed out the different objects worthy of observation. Thus they moved on till Lord Woodville had attained his purpose of drawing his guests entirely apart from the rest of the company, when, turning round upon him, with an air of great solemnity, he addressed him thus: "Richard Brown, my old, very dear friend, we are now alone. Let me conjure you to answer me upon the word of a friend and the honour of a soldier. How did you in reality rest during the night?" "Most wretchedly indeed, my lord," answered the general in the same tones of solemnity. "So miserably that I would not run the risk of such a second night, not only for the lands belonging to the castle, but for all the country which I see from this elevated point of view." "This is most extraordinary," said the young lord, as if speaking to himself. "Then there must be something in the reports concerning that apartment." Again turning to the general, he said, "For God's sake, my dear friend, be candid with me, and let me know this disagreeable particulars which have befallen you under a roof where, with consent of the owner, you should have met nothing save comfort." The general seemed distressed by this appeal, and paused for a moment before he replied. "My dear lord," he at length said, "what happened to me last night is of nature so peculiar and so unpleasant that I could hardly bring myself to detail it even to your lordship, were it not that, independent of my wish to gratify any request of yours, I think that sincerity on my part may lead to some explanation about your circumstance, a circumstance equally painful and mysterious. To others, the communication I am about to make might place me in the light of a weak-minded, superstitious fool, who suffered his own imagination to delude and bewilder him, but you have known me in childhood and in youth, and will not suspect me of having adopted in manhood the feelings and the frailties from which my early years were free." Here he paused, and his friend replied, "Do not doubt my perfect confidence in the truth of your communication, however strange it may be," replied Lord Woodville. "I know your firmness of disposition too well to suspect you could be made the objects of imposition, and I am aware that your honour and your friendship will equally deter you from exaggerating whatever you may have witnessed." "Well then," said the general, "I will proceed with my story as well as I can, relying upon your candour, and yet distinctly feeling that I would rather face a battery than recall to my mind the odious recollections of last night." He paused a second time, and then, perceiving that the Lord Woodville remained silent and in an attitude of attention, he commenced, though not without obvious reluctance, the history of his night adventures in the tapestried chamber. "I undressed and went to bed so soon as your lordship left me yesterday evening. But the wood in the chimney which nearly fronted my bed blazed brightly and cheerfully, and aided by 100 exciting recollections of my childhood and youth, which had been recalled by the unexpected pleasure of meeting your lordship, prevented me from falling immediately asleep. I ought, however, to say that these reflections were all so pleasant and agreeable kind, grounded on a sense of having for time exchanged the labour, fatigues, and dangers of my profession, for the enjoyments of a peaceful life, and the reunion of those friendly and affectionate ties which I had torn asunder at the rude summons of war. While such pleasing reflections were stealing over my mind and gradually lulling me to slumber, I was suddenly aroused by the sound like that of the rustling of a silken gown, and the tapping of a pair of high-heeled shoes, as if a woman were walking in the apartment, ere I could draw the curtain to see what the matter was. The figure of a little woman passed between the bed and the fire. The back of this form was turned to me, and I could observe from the shoulders and neck it was that of an old woman, whose dress was an old-fashioned gown, which I think ladies call a sack. That is sort of a robe completely loose in the body, but gathered into broad plaits upon the neck and shoulders, which fall down to the ground and terminate in this species of train. I thought the intrusion singular enough, but never harbored for a moment the idea that I saw anything more than the mortal form of some old woman about the establishment, who had a fancy to dress like her grandmother, and who, having perhaps, as your lordship mentioned, that you were rather straitened for room, been dislodged from her chamber for my accommodation, and forgotten the circumstance, and returned by 12 to her old haunt. Under this persuasion, I moved myself in bed and coughed a little, to make the intruder sensible of my being in possession of the premises. She turned slowly round, but gracious heaven, my lord, what a countenance did she display to me! There was no longer any question that what she was, or any thought of her being a living being. Upon a face which wore the fixed features of a corpse were imprinted the traces of the vilest and most hideous passions which had animated her while she lived. The body of some atrocious criminal seemed to have been given up from the grave, and the soul restored from the perennial fire to order to form, for a space and union with the ancient accomplice of its guilt. I started up in bed, and I sat upright, supporting myself on my palms, as I gazed on this horrible spectre. The hag made, as it seemed, a single and swift stride to the bed where I lay, and squatted herself down upon it, in precisely the same attitude which I assumed in the extremity of my horror, advancing her diabolical countenance within half a yard of mine, with a grin which seemed to intimate the malice and the derision of an incarnate fiend. Here General Brown stopped, and wiped from his brow the cold perspiration with which the recollection of his horrible vision had covered it. "My lord," he said, "I am no coward, and I have been in all mortal dangers, and dangers incidental to my profession, and I may truly boast that no man ever saw Richard Brown dishonor the sword he wears, but in these horrible circumstances, under the eyes, and it seemed almost in the grasp of the incarnation of an evil spirit. All firmness forsook me, all manhood melted from me like wax in the furnace, and I felt my hair individually bristle. The current of my life blood ceased to flow, and I sank back in a swoon, as very a victim to panic terror as ever was a village girl or a child 10 years old. How long I lay in this condition I cannot pretend to guess. But I was roused by the castle clock striking 1, so loud that it seemed as if it were in the very room. It was some time before I dared open my eyes, lest they should again encounter the horrible spectacle. When, however, I summoned courage to look up, she was no longer visible. My first idea was to pull my bell, wake the servants, and remove to a garret or a hayloft, or to be insured against a second visitation. Nay, I will confess the truth, that my resolution was altered, not by the shame of exposing myself, but by the fear that, as the bell cord hung by the chimney, I might, in making my way to it, be again crossed by the fiendish hag, who, I figured to myself, might still be lurking about some corner of the apartment. I will not pretend to describe what hot and cold fever fits tormented me for the rest of the night, though broken sleep, weary vigils, and that dubious state which forms the neutral ground between them. 100 terrible objects appeared to haunt me, but there was a great difference betwixt the vision which I have described and those which followed, that I knew the last to be the deceptions of my own fancy, and overexcited nerves. Day at last appeared, and I rose from my bed, ill in health and humiliated in mind. I was ashamed of myself as a man and as a soldier, and still more so at feeling my own extreme desire to escape from the haunted apartment, which, however, conquered all other considerations, so that huddling on my clothes with the most careless haste, I made my escape from your lordship's mansion, to seek in the open air relief to my nervous system, shaken as it was this horrible rencounter with this visitant. For such I must believe her. From the other world, your lordship has now heard the cause of my discomposure, and of my sudden desire to leave your hospitable castle. In other places, I trust we may often meet, but God protect me from ever spending a second night under that roof. Strange as the general's tale was, he spoke with such a deep air of conviction that it cut short all the usual commentaries which are made on such stories. Lord Woodville never once asked him if he was sure he did not dream of the apparition, or suggested any of the possibilities by which it was fashionable to explain apparitions. Wild vagaries of fancy or deception of the optic nerves. On the contrary, he seemed deeply impressed with the truth and reality of what he had heard, and, after a considerable pause, regretted with much appearance of sincerity that his early friend should in his house have suffered so severely. "I am the more sorry for your pain, my dear Brown," he said. He continued, "that it is the unhappy, though most unexpected result of an experiment of my own. You must know that for my father and grandfather's time, at least, the apartment which was assigned to you last night had been shut on account of reports that it was disturbed by supernatural sights and noises. When I came a few weeks since into possession of the estate, I thought the accommodation which the castle afforded for my friends was not extensive enough to permit the inhabitants of the invisible world to retain possession of the comfortable sleeping apartment. I therefore caused the tapestried chamber, as we call it, to be opened, and without destroying its air of antiquity, I had such new articles of furniture placed in it as to become the more modern times. Yet, as the opinion that the room was haunted very strongly prevailed among the domestics, and was also known in the neighbourhood and to many of my friends, I feared some prejudice might be entertained by its first occupant of the tapestried chamber, which might tend to revive the evil report which to it had laboured under, and so disappointed my purpose of rendering it a useful part of the house. I must confess, my dear Brown, that your arrival yesterday, agreeable to me for 1,000 reasons besides, seemed the most favourable opportunity of removing the unpleasant rumours which attached to the room, since your courage was indubitable, and your mind free of any preoccupation on the subject. I could not, therefore, have chosen a more fitting subject for my experiment." "Upon my life," said General Brown, somewhat hastily, "I am infinitely obliged to your lordship, very particularly indebted indeed. I am likely to remember for some time the consequences of the experiment, as your lordship is pleased to call it." "Nay, now you are unjust, my dear friend," said Lord Woodville. "You have only to reflect for a single moment in order to be convinced that I could not augur the possibility of the pain to which you have been unhappily exposed. I was yesterday morning a complete sceptic on the subject of the supernatural appearances. Nay, I am sure that had I told you what was said about that room, those very reports would have induced you, by your own choice, to select it for your own accommodation. It was my misfortune, perhaps my error, but really cannot be termed my fault that you have been afflicted so strangely." "Strangely indeed," said the general, resuming his good temper. "And I acknowledge that I have no right to be offended with your lordship for treating me like what I used to think of myself, a man of some firmness and courage. But I see my post-horses are arrived, and I must not detain your lordship from your amusement." "Nay, my old friend," said Lord Woodville, "since you cannot stay with us another day,
which indeed I can no longer urge, give me at least half an hour more. You used to love pictures, and I have a gallery of portraits, some of them by Van Dyck, representing ancestry to whom this property and castle formerly belonged. I think that several of them will strike you as a possessing merit." General Brown accepted the invitation, though somewhat unwillingly. It was evident he was not to breathe freely or at ease till he left Woodville Castle far behind him. He could not refuse his friend's invitation, however, and the less so that he was a little ashamed of his peevishness which he had displayed towards his well-meaning entertainer. The general, therefore, followed Lord Woodville through several rooms into a long gallery hung with pictures, which the latter pointed out to his guests, telling the names and giving some account of the personages whose portraits presented themselves in progression. General Brown was but little interested in the details which these accounts conveyed to him. They were indeed of the kind which were usually found in an old family gallery. Here was a cavalier who had ruined the estate in the royal cause. There, a fine lady who had reinstated it by contracting a match with a wealthy Roundhead. There hung a gallant who had been in danger for corresponding with the exiled court at St. Germain's. Here, one who had taken arms for William at the Revolution, and there a third that had thrown his weight alternately into the scale of Whig and Tory. While Lord Woodville was cramming these words into the guest's ear, against the stomach of his sense, they gained the middle of the gallery. Then when he beheld General Brown suddenly start, and assume an attitude of utmost surprise, not unmixed with fear, as his eyes were caught and suddenly riveted by a portrait of an old lady in a sack, the fashionable dress, the end of the 17th century. "There she was," he exclaimed. "There she is, in form and features, though inferior in demonic expression, the accursed hag who visited me last night." "If that be the case," said the young nobleman, "there can remain no longer any doubt of the horrible reality of your apparition, that in the picture of the wretched ancestress of mine, of whose crimes a black and fearful catalogue is recorded in family history in my charter chest, the recital of them would be too horrible. It is enough to say that in yon fatal apartment incest and unnatural murder were committed. I will restore it to the solitude to which the better judgment of those who precede me had consigned it, and never shall anyone, so long as I can prevent it, be exposed to the repetition of the supernatural horrors which could shake such courage as yours." Thus, the friends who had met with such glee parted in a very different mood. Lord Woodville to command the tapestried chamber to be unmantled and the door built up, and General Brown to seek in some less beautiful country, and with some less dignified friend, forgetfulness of the painful night which he had passed at Woodville Castle. That's where I end for the night. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody, for being here on this ghost story Victorian Christmas special. I will probably continue to go ahead and read next week some other ghost stories, some Victorian ghost stories. Ghost stories around Christmas time were tradition all over the world because it is, dark of the night, and why not? You can find me on Patreon under The Gentleman's House if you can. If you can't give, I love you. It's okay. If you can, it helps me out tremendously. Likes, comments, shares, those help me out tremendously too. You can leave one-time donations at my PayPal under rlillard6@gmail.com. Soon I'll have another one up for the Gentleman Psychic alone because things get muddled. And you can also find me on Venmo under Richard-Lael Lillard. And, only if you can give. If not, it's quite all right. Don't harm yourself, but it does help me out tremendously. You keep me going in these times, and as viewers like you.
I am very lucky to have you in my world. Those of you who stayed to watch, those of you who are watching in the future, those of you that have come and gone, I love you, I appreciate you. And with that, I bid you good night. Don't look under the bed.